An elderly woman disrupts a high society dinner at Boston's most exclusive restaurant, claiming she built it decades ago. Her shocking revelations threaten to unravel deep secrets and buried betrayals. Who will stand for justice and who will fight to keep the truth hidden? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. It was a busy Friday evening at the Golden Palace, the most exclusive restaurant in downtown Boston. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead as waiters in crisp black uniforms moved smoothly between tables, serving champagne and expensive steaks to the city's elite. Every table was filled with people who had waited months for a reservation. Rebecca Chen, the restaurant manager, stood at her usual spot near the entrance, making sure everything ran perfectly. She had worked here for 15 years and took pride in maintaining its reputation as the city's finest dining establishment. Tonight was especially important. Several city council members were dining with potential investors. Miss Chen, table 7 is requesting to speak with the sommelier. Thomas, one of the senior waiters, informed her quietly. Tell James to... Rebecca stopped mid-sentence. Through the revolving glass doors came an elderly woman wearing tattered clothes and carrying a worn plastic shopping bag. The woman's grey hair was unkempt, and her coat was several sizes too big. The busy restaurant fell silent. Forks stopped mid-bite. Conversations died. All eyes turned to stare at the unexpected visitor. "Oh my God," whispered Amanda Porter, a regular customer loud enough for nearby tables to hear. How did she get past the doorman? The elderly woman didn't seem to notice the stares. She walked slowly, looking around the restaurant with curious eyes touching the elegant wallpaper with gentle fingers. Rebecca quickly moved toward her. "Ma'am, I'm afraid you'll have to leave. This is a private establishment." The old woman smiled. "It's even more beautiful than I remembered," she said softly. "You've kept the original moldings. That's good." "Security," Rebecca called out, her face flushing with embarrassment. Two large men in dark suits appeared immediately. "Please," the woman said, reaching into her shopping bag. "Just give me a moment." "Don't make this difficult," one of the security guards said, reaching for her arm. "Get this homeless person out of here before she ruins everyone's dinner," demanded Richard Maxwell, a wealthy real estate developer, from his table near the front. The woman pulled something from her bag, an old photograph in a silver frame. She held it up for everyone to see. The photo showed a much younger woman with dark hair, wearing an elegant dress, cutting a ribbon in front of the Golden Palace's entrance. The date stamped on the photo was May 15, 1975. "My name is Cora Sullivan," the woman announced, her voice stronger now. "I built this restaurant 48 years ago with my husband Michael. We created it as a place where people could come together and share not just meals but humanity." The restaurant fell completely silent again, but this time for a different reason. "That's impossible," Rebecca said, but her voice wavered as she looked between the photo and the woman's face. Despite the years and hardship evident in every line, the eyes were unmistakably the same. "I've been watching this place from across the street for weeks," Cora continued. "I've seen how you treat people. The way you turned away that young family last week because their clothes weren't expensive enough. How you made that elderly gentleman wait for an hour despite his reservation because you gave his table to a celebrity." She turned to face the dining room. "This restaurant was built on love and respect. My Michael used to say that everyone who walked through those doors was a guest in our home. But look at what it's become, a monument to exclusion and snobbery." Richard Maxwell stood up, his face red. "Someone call the police. This woman is clearly disturbed." "Actually," came a new voice, "that won't be necessary." An older man stood up from a corner table. "I'm Daniel Harrison, City Historical Society. I recognized Mrs. Sullivan the moment she walked in. She's telling the truth. The Golden Palace was the crown jewel of Boston's restaurant scene in the 1970s and 80s, known as much for its charitable work as its excellent food. Until the scandal of course." "What scandal?" several voices asked at once. Cora's eyes filled with tears. "My husband's death, the betrayal by our business partner, the lawsuits that took everything. But that's not why I'm here tonight." A young waitress named Sarah stepped forward, offering Cora a chair. The old woman sat down gratefully. Thank you, dear. You're the first person to show me kindness since I walked in. She looked around the room again. I came here tonight because I heard this place is up for sale again, and I wanted to see what had become of our dream before it changes hands once more. The revelation sent whispers rippling through the dining room. Rebecca Chen's face went pale. The sale wasn't public knowledge yet. But mostly, Cora continued, I came to remind everyone in this room of something very important. Life can change in an instant. Today's millionaire can be tomorrow's beggar. What remains constant is how we treat each other. The true measure of a person or a restaurant isn't in the price of the wine list or the exclusivity of the clientele. It's in the warmth of the welcome extended to every single person who walks through the door. She stood up slowly, clutching her shopping bag. I'll go now. I've said what I came to say. She turned toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Maxwell, that wine you're drinking. You're paying 3 times what it's worth. Michael would never have allowed such markup. As Cora walked toward the exit, Sarah, the waitress, hurried after her. Mrs. Sullivan, wait, please. Would you join me for coffee? I'd love to hear more about the restaurant's history. Cora smiled warmly. That would be lovely, dear. But perhaps somewhere else? I know a small diner around the corner where everyone is welcome. As the door closed behind them, the elegant dining room of the Golden Palace remained unusually quiet. Guests looked at their expensive meals with less appetite than before. Rebecca Chen stood frozen, staring at the space where Cora had been, thinking about all the people she'd turned away over the years. And in his corner, Daniel Harrison smiled to himself as he pulled out his phone to make a call. The Historical Society had been looking for Cora Sullivan for years. Perhaps it wasn't too late to right some old wrongs and restore the Golden Palace to what it was always meant to be. The story of Cora Sullivan's return was just beginning. The next morning, Sarah Martinez sat across from Cora Sullivan in Jenny's Diner, a small family-owned restaurant that had been serving breakfast to Boston's working class for 3 decades. The contrast between this warm, bustling place and the Golden Palace couldn't have been more striking. More coffee, Mrs. Sullivan? Jenny herself came over with a fresh pot. Please, call me Cora, the older woman smiled. And yes, thank you. Your coffee reminds me of what we used to serve at the palace. Michael always said good coffee was the foundation of any restaurant. Sarah leaned forward, still wearing her uniform from her morning shift. What happened, Mrs. Sullivan? How did you lose everything? Cora's hands tightened around her coffee cup. It's not a happy story, dear, but perhaps it's time someone knew the truth. She took a deep breath and began to speak. After Michael died, it wasn't just a heart attack like the papers said. He discovered something terrible. Our business partner, Victor Reynolds, had been stealing from us for years. Not just money, but something much worse. What do you mean? Sarah asked. The Golden Palace wasn't just a restaurant. We had a foundation that helped struggling families start their own businesses. Victor had been taking that money, using it for his own schemes. When Michael confronted him, Cora's voice trembled. 3 days later, my husband was dead. Jenny, who had been listening, sat down at their table. I remember reading about Mr. Sullivan's death. The papers said it was natural causes. That's what the official report said. But Michael had no history of heart problems. The night before he died, he told me he was going to expose everything. He had proof in his office. But after his death, when I went to look, everything was gone. Sarah gasped. You think Mr. Reynolds? I could never prove anything. But within weeks, Victor produced documents showing he owned majority shares in the restaurant. Apparently, Michael had signed them over to him. The signatures looked real, but Michael would never have done that. When I tried to fight it in court, Victor's lawyers buried me in paperwork. He had friends in high places. Eventually, I lost everything: the restaurant, our house, my reputation. But surely someone would have helped you, Sarah asked. Victor spread rumors that I had lost my mind with grief, that I was making wild accusations. Our old friend stopped returning my calls. The society papers painted me as a bitter widow trying to hold onto her husband's legacy. After a while, it seemed easier to just disappear. Jenny wiped tears from her eyes. All these years you've been living on the streets. Not at first. I had a small apartment, worked odd jobs. But medical bills piled up and eventually, well, you see how it ended up. Cora managed a small smile. But I never stopped watching the palace. I needed to know what became of our dream. Sarah pulled out her phone, quickly typing something. Mrs. Sullivan, have you seen this? The current owner of the Golden Palace is trying to sell it to a developer. They're planning to tear it down and build luxury condos. What? Cora's face went pale. No, they can't. The building is part of Boston's history. Michael and I had it registered as a historical landmark. That designation was removed 5 years ago, came a voice from behind them. They turned to see Daniel Harrison from the Historical Society standing there. Mrs. Sullivan, I've been looking for you for a very long time. He sat down, ordering coffee from Jenny. Victor Reynolds died 6 months ago. His estate is being settled, and some interesting documents have surfaced, including a confession. Cora's hands began to shake. Sarah quickly steadied her coffee cup. He admitted everything, Cora whispered. And more. The police have reopened the investigation into your husband's death, but more importantly, for the immediate future, he left proof that the documents transferring ownership were indeed forged. Mrs. Sullivan, with your permission, the Historical Society would like to help you reclaim what's rightfully yours. Sarah grabbed Cora's hand. This is amazing. You could get the palace back. But Cora was shaking her head. I'm too old, dear. I couldn't run a restaurant now. Maybe not alone, Sarah said slowly. But what if you had help? I've worked in restaurants since I was 16. I know the business. And Jenny here probably knows more about making people feel welcome than anyone in Boston. Jenny smiled. She's right about that. And I know plenty of people who'd love to help restore the Golden Palace to what it used to be. The Historical Society would be interested in partnering on this project, Daniel added. We could provide grants for restoration, help with the legal work. The palace isn't just your legacy, Mrs. Sullivan. It's part of Boston's soul. Cora looked around the table at these people. A young waitress, a diner owner, a historian, all offering to help restore not just a building, but a dream. Her eyes filled with tears. Michael always said that good food brings people together, but it's love that keeps them coming back. Maybe it's time to prove him right again. Sarah squeezed her hand. Where do we start? First, Cora said, sitting up straighter, some of her old determination returning. We need to stop. Tell that sale. Then we need to talk to Rebecca Chen. The manager who tried to throw you out last night, Jenny asked, surprised. Yes, because despite everything, she clearly loves that restaurant, and we're going to need all the help we can get. Cora's eyes twinkled. Besides, sometimes the people who seem most lost just need someone to show them the way home. As they began to plan, the morning sun streamed through Jenny's diner's windows, promising the dawn of a new day, not just for the Golden Palace, but for everyone whose lives it was about to touch. What none of them knew was that Victor Reynolds had left behind more secrets than just his confession, and his son James, who had inherited his father's taste for wealth, but none of his remorse, was already making plans of his own for the Golden Palace's future. Rebecca Chen sat alone in her office at the Golden Palace, staring at the front page of the Boston Herald. The headline read, "Lost Legacy, Famous Restaurant's True Owner Returns." Below was a photo of Cora Sullivan from her younger days, side by side with a picture someone had snapped of her at the restaurant last night. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing all morning. Food critics, local news stations, and even some regular customers all wanted to know if it was true. Was the Golden Palace's legendary founder really alive? And had she really been living on the streets? A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called out, quickly wiping her eyes. Thomas, the head waiter, entered looking worried. "Miss Chen, there's someone here to see you. Says his name is James." "Reynolds," Rebecca's head snapped up. "Victor Reynolds' son, sent him in immediately." James Reynolds walked in like he owned the place, which technically his father's company did. He was younger than Rebecca expected, maybe early 30s, wearing an expensive suit that screamed old money. But there was something cold in his eyes that made her uncomfortable. "Quite a mess we have here, wouldn't you say?" James sat down without waiting to be invited. That old woman's little drama last night is all over social media. Mr. Reynolds, I'm so sorry. I had no idea who she was. He cut her off with a wave of his hand. Don't worry about it. In fact, this might work in our favor. The publicity could drive up the sale price. Sale price? Rebecca felt her stomach drop. But I thought the deal with Maxwell Development was already set. It was. Until Richard Maxwell called this morning to back out. Seems he's worried about bad publicity if he tears down a beloved Boston institution. James made air quotes with his fingers. Especially now that people are getting all sentimental about Cora Sullivan's sob story. Before Rebecca could respond, there was another knock. This time it was Sarah, still in her waitress uniform despite having missed her morning shift. Miss Chen, I need to talk to you about Mrs. Sullivan. Sarah stopped short when she saw James. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were busy. You're fired, Rebecca said automatically. You didn't show up for work this morning. Actually, Sarah stepped fully into the office. I was working, just not here. She pulled out her phone and showed them a video. It was Cora Sullivan, sitting in what looked like a diner, telling stories about the Golden Palace's early days. The video had over 100,000 views already. James stood up so quickly, his chair almost fell over. Take that down immediately. You don't have authorization to post videos about this restaurant. The video was posted by the Boston Historical Society, Sarah replied calmly. They're very interested in preserving the palace's history, especially now that they have proof that ownership transfer to Victor Reynolds was fraudulent. The color drained from James's face. What did you say? Your father confessed everything before he died, Mr. Reynolds, said a new voice. Daniel Harrison walked in, followed by Cora Sullivan herself. But this wasn't the same shabby woman from last night. Someone had helped her clean up, given her proper clothes. Despite her age, she carried herself with dignity. All these years, Cora said softly, looking around the office. This was Michael's favorite room. He used to say he could feel the heart of the restaurant beating here. She turned to Rebecca. You've kept it exactly the same. Rebecca found herself fighting tears. The decoration manual said this room was never to be changed. I never knew why. Because some things are sacred, Cora smiled, like memories and truth. James Reynolds laughed, but there was no humor in it. Truth? You want truth? Here's truth. This restaurant is owned by Reynolds Enterprises. Whatever delusions you're all operating under, whatever confession you think you have, nothing changes that. Actually, Daniel Harrison pulled out some papers. These change that. Your father's confession isn't just about the forged ownership documents. He also admitted to destroying evidence about Michael Sullivan's death. The police are very interested in reopening that investigation. James went pale. You're bluffing. Am I? Daniel raised an eyebrow. Your father felt guilty enough at the end to write everything down, including what really happened the night Michael Sullivan died. Rebecca watched this exchange with growing horror. She'd worked at the palace for 15 years, built her whole life around it. Now, everything she thought she knew was crumbling. Miss Chen, Cora turned to her. I saw how you run this place. Despite everything, you care about it deeply. That's why I'm here. We want to restore the palace, make it what it was always meant to be. But we need help from someone who knows it inside and out. Why would you want my help? Rebecca whispered. After how I treated you. Because everyone deserves a second chance. Even this young man. Cora glanced at James, who was now furiously texting on his phone. Though he'll have to decide quickly which side of history he wants to be on. Sarah stepped forward. We have a plan. The Historical Society, local business owners, even some of your regular customers want to help. We can make the palace great. Again, not just exclusive, but exceptional. A place that honors its past while building a new future. Rebecca looked around her office, at James Reynolds trying to hide his panic, at Daniel Harrison with his damning documents, at Sarah's hopeful face, and finally at Cora Sullivan, standing in her husband's office like she'd never left. She made her decision. Mr. Reynolds, Rebecca stood up straight. Consider this my resignation. I quit. You can't, James sputtered. You signed a non-compete clause. With Reynolds Enterprises, Daniel smiled. which, very shortly, will no longer own this restaurant. Those clauses don't transfer when ownership is proven fraudulent. As if on cue, the office door opened again. 2 police detectives walked in. "James Reynolds?" one of them asked. "We need to ask you some questions about your father's recent confession and some financial documents we've discovered." Cora watched as the detectives led a protesting James away. Then she turned to Rebecca and Sarah. "Well, ladies," she said, "shall we see what's for lunch? I believe we have a restaurant to save." But even as they began to plan, none of them noticed the small flash drive that had fallen from James's pocket in his hurry to leave. A flash drive that contained secrets that could either save the Golden Palace or destroy it forever. The cleaning crew at the Golden Palace was just finishing up when Sarah noticed something glinting under the desk in Rebecca's office. She bent down to pick it up, a small flash drive that must have fallen during the confrontation with James Reynolds earlier that day. "Mrs. Sullivan," she called out, "I think you need to see this." Cora looked up from where she and Rebecca were going through old financial records. The 3 women had spent the afternoon trying to understand exactly how Victor Reynolds had managed to take control of the restaurant all those years ago. "What did you find, dear?" Cora asked, taking the flash drive with trembling hands. Rebecca quickly pulled out her laptop. "Should we look?" "After everything that's happened, I think we need to," Cora said firmly. She handed the drive to Rebecca, who plugged it in. The files that popped up made them all gasp. There were dozens of folders labeled with dates going back 30 years. But what caught their attention was one named M. Sullivan, Final Night. "That's the night Michael died," Cora whispered. Rebecca clicked on the folder. Inside was a video file. The timestamp showed 11:42 p.m., the night of Michael Sullivan's death. The security footage was grainy, but they could clearly see Michael's office, this very room, and 2 men arguing. "Turn up the volume," Sarah said, leaning closer. "Can't let you do this, Victor." Michael Sullivan's voice was angry but controlled. "That money was meant to help people, not fund your gambling debts." "Be reasonable, Michael." Victor Reynolds paced the room. "No one has to know. We'll replace the foundation money slowly. I just need time." "Time?" Michael slammed his hand on the desk. "You've stolen millions from families who trusted us. I'm going to the police in the morning." Victor's voice turned cold. "Think about Cora, about everything she'll lose." "Cora would rather lose everything than live on stolen money." Michael turned to his safe, pulling out a thick folder. "It's over, Victor." The video showed Victor Reynolds reaching into his jacket. Sarah grabbed Cora's hand as they watched Victor pull out a small bottle. "Just think of it as an early retirement," Victor said, and threw the contents of the bottle into Michael's face. As Michael gasped and clutched his chest, Victor quickly caught him and lowered him into his chair, making it look like he had simply slumped over. The video ended. The office was silent except for Cora's quiet sobs. "He murdered him," Rebecca whispered. "Made it look like a heart attack." "The police need to see this," Sarah started to say, but suddenly the laptop screen went black. "What happened?" Cora asked. Rebecca tried rebooting, but nothing worked. "The files, they're gone. The drive must have had some kind of self-destruct program." "But we saw it," Sarah insisted. "We can tell the police." "It would be our word against his," Rebecca said quietly. "Without the actual video." Cora stood up suddenly. "The safe." "What?" "In the video, Michael took something from the safe. Before..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "Is it still here?" Rebecca walked to the wood paneling behind the desk, pressing a hidden catch. A small safe door swung open. "I never knew the combination." "Try 11-22-47, Cora said. "Our wedding." "Date." The safe clicked open. Inside was an old folder, its pages yellow with age, and a sealed envelope with "For Cora, if anything happens," written in Michael's handwriting. Before they could examine the contents, they heard footsteps in the hallway. Heavy footsteps, like multiple people approaching. "Quick," Rebecca whispered, hiding the folder and envelope in her bag. "Act natural." The door burst open. 2 men in expensive suits walked in, followed by James Reynolds and a woman none of them recognized. Alexandra Maxwell, the woman announced. Legal counsel for Maxwell Development. I understand there's some confusion about the ownership of this property. There's no confusion, James said smugly. I have a court order here confirming Reynolds Enterprises' ownership and authorizing us to begin immediate renovations. Everyone needs to leave now. But the Historical Society, Sarah began, has no standing, Alexandra cut her off. The landmark status was legally removed. This building belongs to my clients. And what about the proof that Victor Reynolds forged the ownership documents? Rebecca demanded. Alexandra smiled coldly. Interesting theory. Do you have any actual evidence of that? The three women looked at each other helplessly. The video was gone. They hadn't had time to examine the documents from the safe. And now, ladies, one of the suited men said firmly, you need to leave the premises immediately. Security will escort you out. As they were led toward the door, Cora turned to James Reynolds. You're just like your father, willing to destroy anything for money. Something flickered in James's eyes. Guilt? Fear? But he quickly looked away. Outside the Golden Palace, standing on the sidewalk where she'd spent so many years watching, her beloved restaurant from afar, Cora finally opened the envelope from Michael. Inside was a key and a note. My darling, if you're reading this, something has happened to me. Remember our special place? Everything you need is there. Trust no one except Rebecca Chen. Rebecca Chen? Sarah looked confused. But how could he have known about her? She didn't start working here until years after he died. Cora read the note again, her eyes wide with shock. Unless... Rebecca, what was your mother's name? Rebecca's face went pale. Catherine Chen. She used to work here as a waitress, a long time ago. Catherine, Cora breathed. Michael's secretary, the one who disappeared right after his death. Oh my God. They all stared at each other as the implications sank. And the mystery of the Golden Palace was far from over. In fact, it was deeper than any of them had imagined. And somewhere in the gathering darkness, a car was parked across the street, its driver watching them intently through tinted windows. On the passenger seat lay an old photograph showing Michael Sullivan, Victor Reynolds, and a beautiful young Asian woman at the restaurant's opening. The woman's face had been circled in red ink. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. Jenny's diner had closed for the night, but the lights were still on. Jenny herself had insisted they use her back office when Cora explained they needed a safe place to talk. Now surrounded by old receipts and coffee-stained papers, Rebecca Chen stared at a photograph she'd found in her mother's belongings years ago, but never fully understood until now. That was taken at the staff Christmas party, 1975, Cora said, softly, looking at the photo over Rebecca's shoulder. In it, a young Catherine Chen stood between Michael and Cora Sullivan, all of them wearing Santa hats and laughing. My mother never talked about working at the palace, Rebecca said. When I got the job there 15 years ago, she actually tried to talk me out of it. Now I'm wondering if she knew, if all this time... Catherine was more than just Michael's secretary, Cora explained, sitting down heavily. She was our friend. She helped us start the foundation that helped struggling families. She kept all the records, knew every detail of what Victor Reynolds was stealing. Sarah, who had been examining Michael's note, looked up. Is that why she disappeared after Mr. Sullivan's death? She must have been scared, Cora nodded. Victor Reynolds was a powerful man. If she knew the truth about Michael's death. But why didn't she ever tell me? Rebecca's voice cracked. She raised me alone, worked 3 jobs to put me through school. All those years she could have said something. To protect you, came a quiet voice from the doorway. They all turned to see an elderly Asian woman standing there. Catherine Chen looked older, her hair now gray, but her eyes were sharp as ever. Mom! Rebecca stood up so quickly she knocked over her chair. What are you doing here? Jenny called me, Catherine said. She recognized me from the old days, said you were all here talking about Michael. She looked at Cora, tears in her eyes. Oh, Cora, I'm so sorry I ran. I was such a coward. No. Cora stood and hugged her old friend. You were smart. You had a daughter to protect. As the 2 older women held each other, Sarah noticed something fall from Catherine's purse, a small red notebook. "Mrs. Chen?" Sarah picked it up. "You dropped this." Catherine pulled away from Cora, suddenly looking alarmed. "Be careful with that. It's why I came tonight. That notebook, it's what Michael gave me the night he died." Everyone gathered around as Catherine opened the notebook. Inside were columns of numbers, dates, and what looked like code names. "Michael knew Victor was stealing from the foundation," Catherine explained. "He asked me to help him track everything. This notebook contains every transaction, every fake charity, every shell company Victor used to hide the money." "The evidence Michael was going to take to the police," Cora breathed. "Yes. The night he confronted Victor, Michael gave me this notebook and told me to keep it safe. He said if anything happened to him, I should make sure it got to the right people at the right time." Catherine's hands shook. "I heard about his death the next morning. I knew it wasn't natural causes, but I had no proof. And then Victor's men started watching my house." "So you ran," Rebecca finished. "Changed our names, started over." "To protect you," Catherine touched her daughter's cheek. "You were only 6 years old. What kind of life would you have had if Victor Reynolds had come after us?" Before anyone could respond, Jenny burst into the office. "There are men in suits asking questions at the bar. They're showing people a photo of Mrs. Chen." Catherine quickly stuffed the notebook into her purse. "They must have followed me. We need to leave." "Now?" "The back door," Jenny said. "My car's in the alley." As they hurried through the kitchen, Sarah remembered something. "Mrs. Sullivan, what about the key? The one in Michael's note. What's our special place?" "The key?" Cora's eyes widened. "Of course. Michael and I had a secret place where we kept our most important documents. A safety deposit box at First Boston Bank." "Which closed 20 years ago," Rebecca said. "The building's still there," Jenny called from the back door. "It's a vintage clothing store now. My sister works there." They could hear voices getting closer from the front of the diner. "We can't all go," Catherine said quickly. "They're looking for me. I'll lead them away while you go to the bank building." "Mom, no!" Rebecca grabbed her arm. "Trust me, sweetheart. I've been running from these people for 30 years. I know what I'm doing." Catherine hugged her daughter fiercely. "Go with Cora, find what Michael left. It's time for the truth to come out." Before anyone could argue, Catherine slipped out the back door and disappeared into the night. Moments later, they heard cars starting up and speeding away. "She'll be okay," Jenny assured Rebecca. "Your mother's one tough lady. Now come on. I'll drive you to the old bank." As they piled into Jenny's car, Cora clutched Michael's note tightly. "All these years," she whispered, "you were still trying to protect us, weren't you, my love?" But even as they drove through Boston's darkened streets, more players were entering the game. In his office across town, James Reynolds was meeting with someone who had their own interest in the Golden Palace's secrets. "Find that notebook," James insisted, "and the old woman's friend, Catherine Chen. She's the key to all of this." "And if she won't cooperate?" asked his visitor. James turned to look out his window at the city lights. "Then make her cooperate, whatever it takes." The pieces were moving, the stakes rising, and somewhere in an old bank building, Michael Sullivan's last secret waited to be discovered, a secret that could change everything. The vintage clothing store that now occupied the old First Boston Bank building was dark and quiet when Jenny pulled up across the street. Through the windows, mannequins in elegant old dresses stood like silent sentinels. "My sister Rita keeps a key under the flower pot," Jenny said, pulling up to the back entrance. "She opens early to inventory new arrivals. No one will think twice about seeing lights on." Rebecca was still staring at her phone, waiting for any message from her mother. "I should have gone with her." "Catherine knows what she's doing." Cora touched her arm gently. "She protected you all these years. Trust her to protect herself." They found the key where Jenny said it would be and slipped inside. The store's interior was a maze of clothing racks and display cases. The original bank's marble columns and high ceilings gave everything an elegant, haunted feel. "The safety deposit boxes would have been in the basement," Sarah said, shining her phone's flashlight around. "There should be stairs somewhere." "Over here," Jenny called out, pushing aside a rack of vintage wedding dresses. A door marked "Employees Only" revealed a narrow staircase leading down. The basement was surprisingly well preserved. Rows of Old safety deposit boxes still lined the walls, their brass numbers dulled with age. "Number 1147, Cora said firmly. "Our wedding date." They found the box easily enough. The key from Michael's envelope fit perfectly, but years of disuse had made the lock stiff. It took both Sarah and Rebecca turning it together to finally open it. Inside was a single manila envelope, sealed with wax, and a small tape recorder. "Play it," Cora whispered. Michael Sullivan's voice filled the basement, crackling with age but still clear. "My darling Cora, if you're hearing this, then my suspicions about Victor were right. He's not just stealing from the Foundation, it's worse than that. The Foundation was a cover for something bigger. Remember those special investors he brought in last year? They're using our restaurant, our dream, to launder money for the mob." They all looked at each other in shock as the recording continued. "Catherine's been helping me gather evidence. Bank records, fake charities, shell companies. It's all documented. But Victor must have figured out what we were doing. Yesterday, one of our Foundation families was threatened, a single mother and her kids. They had to leave town in the middle of the night. I can't let this go on." There was a pause and Michael's voice grew softer. "Cora, my love, I'm meeting Victor tonight. Catherine has copies of everything. She'll know what to do with them. The evidence in this envelope is our insurance policy. If anything happens to me, take it to Judge Margaret Hawkins. She's one of the few people in this city Victor can't buy." The recording ended. With trembling hands, Cora opened the envelope. Inside were photographs, documents, and a letter signed by Victor Reynolds himself, admitting to using the restaurant's foundation to launder mob money. "This is it," Sarah breathed. "This is what we need to prove everything." Suddenly they heard footsteps upstairs, heavy footsteps, moving purposefully. "Someone's here," Jenny whispered. Rebecca quickly took photos of all the documents with her phone. "Just in case," she said. The footsteps were getting closer to the basement door. They killed their lights and pressed themselves against the wall just as the door opened. "They have to be down here somewhere," a familiar voice said. James Reynolds. "Check every box," another voice ordered. "Mr. Reynolds wants whatever's in that safety deposit box destroyed." Flashlight. Beams swept the basement. Sarah looked around desperately for another way out. There was a small window near the ceiling, probably an old coal chute, but it would be a tight squeeze. Jenny pointed to a rack of old cleaning supplies. "I have an idea," she whispered. "When I say run, head for the back stairs." Before anyone could stop her, Jenny grabbed a bottle of bleach and one of ammonia. "Hey!" she shouted, and threw both bottles toward the flashlight beams. The bottles shattered, and the chemicals mixed. "Gas!" one of the men shouted. Everyone started coughing and running for the stairs. "Now!" Jenny pushed them toward the back exit she'd spotted earlier. They ran up a narrow service staircase and burst out into the alley behind the building. "My car's around front," Jenny gasped. "We can't go that way," Rebecca said. "They'll be watching it." Suddenly, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. The window rolled down, revealing Catherine, Shen behind the wheel. "Get in," she ordered. "Quickly!" They piled into the car just as James Reynolds and his men stumbled out of the building, still coughing. "How did you know where to find us?" Rebecca asked, as her mother sped through Boston's back streets. "Because I remembered," Catherine said, simply. "I remembered everything about that night, including where Michael would have hidden the evidence. I've been watching the building since I gave you the slip." "Mom," Rebecca started to say, but Catherine cut her off. "Not now, sweetheart. We need to get somewhere safe. Those men didn't just work for James Reynolds. I recognized one of them. He's connected to the same mob family that was using the palace 30 years ago. But we have the evidence now," Sarah said. "We can go to the police." "First, we need to find Judge Hawkins," Cora said firmly, clutching the envelope. Michael trusted her. After all these years, she might be the only person who can help us end this. "If she's still alive," Jenny pointed out. "She is," Catherine said, making a sharp turn onto a residential street. "I looked her up after I got Jenny's call. She retired 5 years ago, lives in a little house in Cambridge." They drove in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally, Rebecca spoke. "Those men will be watching the judge's house." "Yes," Catherine agreed. Which is why we're not going there, not yet. She pulled up in front of an old church. Father Thomas is an old friend. He'll hide us until morning. Then we can figure out our next move. As they hurried into the church's side entrance, none of them noticed the black SUV that had been following them since they left the bank building. Inside, a man picked up his phone. "Boss, they got something from the safety deposit box. But don't worry, I know exactly where they're going." In his office, James Reynolds hung up the phone and turned to his companion, the same elegant woman who had served him so well at the palace. "Alexandra," he said to the lawyer, "I think it's time we paid Judge Hawkins a visit, tonight." The cue pieces were in place. The next few hours would determine not just the fate of the Golden Palace, but possibly the lives of everyone involved in its story. The old church was quiet, except for the sound of rain against stained glass windows. Father Thomas, a kind-faced man in his 70s, had settled them in the church basement's small meeting room, with coffee and sandwiches from the food pantry. "Catherine," he said, sitting down heavily in an old wooden chair, "when you called, asking for sanctuary, I never imagined you'd bring Cora Sullivan with you. We all thought you were dead." Cora smiled sadly. "Sometimes I felt like I was, but tonight has brought many ghosts back to life. Rebecca was trying to reach Judge Hawkins on her phone. Nothing. It keeps going to voicemail." "Try her clerk," Catherine suggested. "Margaret always had someone working late. How do you know so much about the judge?" Sarah asked. Catherine and Cora exchanged a look. "Because," Cora said quietly, "Margaret Hawkins was on our foundations board before everything fell apart." "Which means she knew about the mob money?" Jenny asked. "No," Father Thomas shook his head. "None of us on the board knew. That's why Victor Reynolds was so careful with his paperwork. The foundation did real good work, helping families start businesses, providing education funds. It was the perfect cover." Everyone turned to stare at him. "You were on the board too?" Sarah gasped. "Yes, and I've carried the guilt of not seeing through Victor's lies for 30 years. He looked at Cora. "When Michael died, we all believed what we were told. A heart attack, natural causes. We never questioned." "Because Victor Reynolds made sure you couldn't," Catherine said bitterly. "He threatened anyone who might have asked questions. That's why I ran with Rebecca, why other board members suddenly moved away or changed jobs." Rebecca's phone suddenly buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. "Judge Hawkins taken to Boston General. Apparent heart attack. Sources say James Reynolds seen leaving her house." "No," Cora whispered, reading the message. "They got to her first." "Maybe not," Sarah said quickly. "The message says she was taken to the hospital. She might still be alive." "We have to get to her," Rebecca stood up. "Before they do." "Wait." Father Thomas held up his hand. "There's something else you need to know. Something I've kept secret all these years." He walked to an old filing cabinet and pulled out a yellowed envelope. The night Michael died, he came to confession. He knew Victor was planning something. After he left, he gave me this. Said if anything happened to him, I should keep it safe. Until it was needed. Inside the envelope was a single piece of paper, a map of the Golden Palace's original foundation, with an X marked in the wine cellar. "Michael said there was a hidden safe," Father Thomas explained, "built into the foundation itself. He kept his most damaging evidence there." "The cellar," Jenny frowned. "But that area was sealed off years ago. Health and safety regulations." "Was it?" Father Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Or did Victor Reynolds want to make sure no one ever looked too closely down there?" Before anyone could respond, they heard the church's heavy front doors open above them. Footsteps echoed on wooden floors. "Father Thomas," a voice called out. "Boston PD, we need to talk to you." The old priest's face went pale. "That's not the police. I know every officer who works this neighborhood." "The wine cellar," Cora said suddenly. "That's where we need to go. Whatever Michael hid there 30 years ago, it must be important enough that they're still trying to protect it." "But the restaurant's sealed up tight," Sarah protested. "Security guards, alarm systems." Jenny smiled. "Actually, I might know a way in. My cousin Mario, he's dating one of the kitchen staff. They sometimes sneak in after hours through the old service tunnel. It connects to the subway maintenance system. The footsteps were getting closer to the basement door. "Go," Father Thomas said firmly. "I'll keep them busy. Catherine, you remember the back way out through the cemetery?" Catherine nodded. "Just like in the old days, Tom. Just like in the old days." He squeezed her hand briefly, then turned to face the door as the others slipped out through a hidden passage behind a storage shelf. The cemetery behind the church was old, its headstones casting long shadows in the rain. As they crept between the graves, Sarah suddenly stopped. "Look," she whispered, pointing to a familiar name on one of the stones. "Michael Sullivan." Cora touched the wet granite gently. "I couldn't afford a proper burial. The church took care of him." She looked at Father Thomas's window, where they could see him talking to shadowy figures. "They took care of both of us." "Mom," Rebecca said suddenly, "did you and Father Thomas help a lot of people escape Victor Reynolds over the years?" Catherine finished. "Yes, the church has many secrets, sweetheart, and many heroes." She touched the headstone next to Michael's, "including your father." Rebecca stared at the name she'd never known. David Chen, beloved husband and father, died protecting the truth. "Later," Catherine promised, seeing the questions in her daughter's eyes. "Right now we need to get to that wine cellar. Mario's tunnel entrance is 2 blocks from here." As they hurried through the rain, Cora took one last look at Michael's grave. "I'll make this right, my love," she whispered. "I promise." But in the basement room they'd just left, Father Thomas was facing his own crisis of conscience as James Reynolds himself sat down across from him. "Tell me, Father," James said smoothly, "do you believe the seal of confession applies to murderers?" Behind him, Alexandra Maxwell opened her briefcase, pulling out papers that made the old priest's heart sink. The night was far from over, and its darkest secrets were still waiting to be revealed. Chapter 8. Underground Truths. The service tunnel was exactly where Jenny's cousin said it would be, hidden behind a maintenance door in the Park Street subway station. The lock had been jimmied so many times, it barely caught anymore. "Mario uses this to meet his girlfriend," Sarah whispered as they made their way down the dark passage. "How romantic." "Young love finds a way," Jenny smiled, leading them with her phone's flashlight. Even through maintenance tunnels, Rebecca walked close to her mother, still processing what she'd learned at the cemetery. "Dad, he worked at the palace too." Catherine nodded slowly. "He was our head chef. That's how we met. He was the one who first noticed something wrong. With the foundation's numbers, he tried to help Michael investigate. And Victor Reynolds had him killed," Rebecca finished, "made it look like a kitchen accident." "You were only 2, Catherine's voice cracked. "The official report said he left the gas on by mistake, but I knew Michael knew. We just couldn't prove it." Cora reached out and squeezed Catherine's hand. "We'll prove it all now, for Michael and David." They came to a junction where 3 tunnels met. Jenny consulted a crude map on her phone. "Mario says the restaurant access is through the middle tunnel. Should be a red door about 50 yards in." As they moved forward, Sarah's phone buzzed. "Update on Judge Hawkins," she reported. "She's stable but unconscious. Hospital's got security outside her room." "James Reynolds won't try anything there," Catherine said. "Too public. He'll wait until—" She stopped suddenly. They all heard it, voices echoing from somewhere ahead. "Check every access point," a man was saying. "Reynolds wants this place locked down tight." Jenny quickly turned off her flashlight. They pressed themselves against the damp tunnel wall as beams of light swept past the junction. "They knew we'd come here," Rebecca whispered. "No," Cora said thoughtfully. "They're protecting something. Something in that wine cellar that's worth killing for, even after 30 years. The voices and lights moved away, heading down one of the other tunnels. "Now's our chance," Jenny said. "The red door can't be far." They found it 5 minutes later, partially hidden behind old pipes. It was heavy steel, painted a dull red, with GP storage stenciled across it. "It's locked," Sarah said, trying the handle. "Like really locked." Catherine stepped forward, pulling something from her pocket, a set of old keys. "Victor Reynolds wasn't the only one who kept secrets," she said. "Michael gave me copies of everything, just in case." The third key worked. The door opened with a groan of rusty hinges. They found themselves in what had clearly once been the Golden Palace's wine cellar. Empty racks lined the walls thick with dust. The air was stale, undisturbed for years. "The map," Cora said. "Where exactly did Michael mark the spot?" Rebecca pulled out the paper Father Thomas had given them. "According to this, it should be under the center rack behind a loose stone." They moved carefully through the cellar, aware that any noise might carry to the floors above. The center rack was larger than the others, built into the wall itself. "Here," Sarah called softly, running her hands along the base. "This stone feels different." It took all of them working together to move the heavy wine rack. Behind it, just as the map showed, was a section of wall that looked slightly different from the rest. Catherine found the loose stone almost immediately. "I watched Michael install this," she said, working it free. "He said it was our insurance policy." Behind the stone was a small cavity. Inside was a metal box, sealed with a combination lock. "Try," Cora started to say. "It's 11/22 to 47, Catherine smiled sadly. "Your wedding date. Michael used it for everything." The box opened with a click. Inside were stacks of papers, photographs, and a small leather-bound notebook. "Financial records," Rebecca said, scanning the first few pages. "Account numbers, dates, names, this is everything. All the proof of how Victor Reynolds laundered money through the foundation." "And more," Catherine held up the notebook. "Michael's personal journal. He documented everything, including his suspicions about what really happened to David." The sound of a door opening somewhere above made them all freeze. "Someone's in the restaurant," Jenny whispered. They could hear footsteps moving across the floor above. Them, then the creak of the cellar stairs. "Hide!" Catherine hissed, pushing them behind the wine racks. The cellar door opened. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. "See?" a familiar voice said. "I told you they'd come here." Father Thomas walked slowly down the stairs, followed by James Reynolds and Alexandra Maxwell. "You've caused enough trouble, old man," James said coldly. "Where are they?" "Gone, Father," Thomas replied calmly. "I sent them somewhere safe." "You're lying." Alexandra's heels clicked on the stone floor as she moved closer to him. "We followed them from the church. They're here somewhere. Aren't they, Cora?" Her voice rose on the last word echoing through the cellar. "Come out now and maybe we can make a deal. The evidence for your lives seems fair." Behind the wine racks, Cora started to step forward, but Catherine held her back. "Wait," she whispered. Then louder. "You want a deal, James? Let's talk about your father's real legacy." She stepped out into the open, holding Michael's journal. "Did you know Victor recorded everything? Every person he killed, every family he destroyed, including how he murdered your mother." James Reynolds' face went white. "What are you talking about?" "Page 47, Catherine said, opening the journal. "Michael wrote it all down. How your mother found out what Victor was doing, how she threatened to go to the police, how Victor made it look like suicide." "You're lying," James's voice shook. "Am I?" asked Alexandra. "She's known all along, haven't you, Alex? After all, you were Victor's lawyer back then too. You helped cover it up." Alexandra Maxwell's calm facade cracked. "Shut up, you stupid woman." "It's all here, James," Catherine continued. "Everything. Your father did. Everything she helped him hide, including what really happened to Michael Sullivan and David Chen and your mother." James Reynolds turned to Alexandra, his hand shaking as he pointed his flashlight at her. "Is it true?" "James," Alexandra said smoothly, "your father was a complicated man. Is it true?" "We did what we had to do," Alexandra snapped. "Your mother was weak, just like you're being weak now. The mob still owns this place, James. Nothing in that. Journal changes that. Nothing changes what has to happen here tonight." She reached into her purse and pulled out a gun, but before she could aim it, the cellar exploded with light. Detective Daniel Harrison and a team of police officers poured down the stairs. "Alexandra Maxwell," Harrison said firmly, "I've been waiting 30 years to say this. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder." As the police led Alexandra and a stunned James away, Cora finally stepped out from behind the wine racks. "Daniel," she said, "how did you know?" "Father Thomas called me as soon as you left the church," the detective smiled. "We've been building A case against the Maxwell family's mob connections for years. Just needed the final proof. He nodded at the journal Catherine still held. Looks like Michael Sullivan provided it. Later, as they all sat in Harrison's office giving statements, Rebecca looked at her mother. "All these years," she said softly, "you kept fighting, kept looking for justice. For your father," Catherine touched her daughter's cheek, "for Michael and Cora. For everyone Victor Reynolds hurt, some fights are worth 30 years. Cora, who had been quiet for a while, suddenly sat up straighter. "Detective Harrison, there's something else we need to discuss. It's about the Golden Palace's future." But before she could continue, Sarah burst into the office, out of breath. "Judge Hawkins," she gasped. "She's awake and she's asking for Cora." The night wasn't over yet, and neither was their story. Boston General Hospital was quiet at this late hour, but Judge Margaret Hawkins's room was a hub of activity. 2 police officers stood guard outside while Detective Harrison interviewed her, recording every word. "I should have come forward years ago," the judge said, her voice weak but determined. "But Victor Reynolds had too much power, too many connections. I was a young judge then, just starting out. He made it clear what would happen if I didn't play along." Cora sat beside her old friend's bed, holding her hand. "We were all afraid, Margaret. He knew exactly how to silence people." Judge Hawkins turned to Detective Harrison. "I have a safe in my chambers, behind the constitutional law volumes. The combination is my appointment date, 05-1482. Everything I've gathered over the years is in there. Every piece of evidence I couldn't use, but couldn't bring myself to destroy." "I'll send officers to secure it immediately." Harrison nodded. "There's more," the judge continued. "Tonight, before whatever they gave me to trigger the heart symptoms, James Reynolds came to my house. He was desperate. Said something about his father's journal being found. He wanted to make a deal." "A deal?" Sarah asked from where she stood near the door. "Immunity, in exchange for testimony against the mob families still connected to the Golden Palace. He said they're planning something big, using the restaurant's renovation as cover for their largest operation yet." Catherine, who had been quietly studying some papers from Michael's journal, looked up sharply. "The construction permits. That's what Alexandra Maxwell was pushing through so quickly. They're not just planning to renovate, they're planning to use the construction to smuggle something," Rebecca finished. "Something big." "Money," Jenny suggested. "Drugs?" "Weapons," Judge Hawkins said firmly. "Military grade, hidden in construction materials. The Golden Palace's location is perfect. Close to the harbor, easy access to major highways. The mob's been using it as a distribution hub for years, even after Victor's death. That's why they fought so hard to keep control of it." Detective Harrison was already on his phone, calling in reinforcements. "When is this shipment supposed to arrive?" "Tomorrow night," the judge said. "That's why they've been so desperate, to keep people away from the restaurant. Once the weapons are moved through, the building really will be demolished. All evidence gone forever." Cora stood up suddenly. "No, I won't let them destroy our dream, not again." "Mrs. Sullivan," Harrison started to say, but Catherine cut him off. "She's right. We have everything we need now. Michael's journal, Judge. Hawkins's evidence, James Reynolds ready to turn state's evidence. We can stop this." "It's too dangerous," Rebecca protested. "These are serious criminals who've been hiding behind respectability for too long," Sarah said firmly. "Using a beautiful place, a place meant to bring people together, as a front for their crimes. It's time someone stood up to them." Judge Hawkins smiled weakly. "Michael would be proud of all of you. But Detective Harrison is right. Let the police handle the weapons bust." "Actually," Harrison said thoughtfully, "we might need your help. The mob will be watching for police activity, but they might not expect anything from a group of women trying to save their restaurant." A plan began to form. While the police prepared their operation, Cora and the others would return to the Golden Palace, seemingly to make one last appeal to save the building. Their presence would provide cover for Harrison's team to move into position. "It'll be dangerous," Harrison warned. "Everything worth doing is dangerous," Cora said simply. "Michael taught me that." As they prepared to leave, Judge Hawkins called Cora back. "Wait, There's one more thing you should know, about the night Michael died. But before she could finish, alarms began blaring throughout the hospital. Code Blue, a voice called over the intercom. Code Blue in the parking garage. Through the window, they could see emergency vehicles converging on the parking structure. Harrison's phone buzzed. James Reynolds, he reported grimly. Someone got to him before he could make his deal. He's been shot. Is he... Sarah couldn't finish the question. Alive, but critical. And the only copy of his statement was in his briefcase, which is missing. Catherine was already moving toward the door. Then we have to move now. Tonight. Before they realize how much we really know. Mom, Rebecca caught her arm. What aren't you telling us? Catherine looked at Judge Hawkins, who nodded slowly. The weapons shipment, Catherine said quietly. It's not coming tomorrow night. That was disinformation in case James talked. It's happening tonight, right now. Suddenly, Sarah's phone buzzed with a news alert. Fire reported at the Golden Palace. Small explosion in the kitchen area. Emergency services responding. It's starting, Cora whispered. They're creating a distraction to cover the delivery. Harrison was already calling in his teams, but Catherine held up her hand. Wait, there's another way, in a way they won't be watching. She turned to Jenny. Your cousin Mario, he knows all the back entrances, right? Every delivery point. Yes, but call him now. As Jenny made the call, Cora looked around at these women who had become so much more than allies. They were family now, bound by a shared mission to save not just a building, but a legacy of hope. Michael always said the Golden Palace was more than just a restaurant, she said softly. It was a symbol of everything good in this city. Tonight we prove him right. Outside the hospital windows, sirens wailed as fire trucks raced toward downtown Boston. The final battle for the Golden Palace was about to begin. But even as they prepared to move, none of them saw the dark figure watching from the hospital corridor, speaking quietly into a phone. They're coming, just like you said they would. Yes, everything's ready. The palace will be their final resting place. Poetic, isn't it? The night was about to become very dangerous indeed. Smoke rose from the Golden Palace into the night sky as fire trucks surrounded the building. But Jenny's cousin Mario had come through. He led Cora, Catherine, Rebecca, Sarah, and Jenny through a service entrance behind the neighboring building, one that connected to the palace's old delivery area. The fire's just a distraction, Catherine whispered as they moved through the dark corridor. They're keeping emergency services focused on the front while they move their shipment through the back. Detective Harrison and his team were in position, waiting for their signal. But first, they needed proof that the weapons were actually there. The familiar corridors of the Golden Palace felt different in the dark, filled with shadows and memories. As they approached the kitchen, they could hear voices ahead. Move faster, someone was ordering. We've got 30 minutes before the fire department clears the building. Everything needs to be gone by then. They peered around a corner to see men moving large crates through the kitchen toward the wine cellar. Standing by the cellar door was a figure they recognized, Alexandra Maxwell's assistant, Thomas. He must have gotten her out of custody, Sarah whispered. No, came a voice behind them. I got myself out. They turned to find Alexandra Maxwell herself standing there, holding a gun. She looked different now. Her elegant suit was gone, replaced by practical dark clothes. But her cold smile was the same. I have to admit, she said, you've all been incredibly persistent. 30 years I've protected this operation, and you just wouldn't let it go. Because some things are worth fighting for, Cora said firmly, standing her ground. This place was meant to bring people together, not tear them apart. How noble, Alexandra sneered. But this was never about your precious restaurant, Cora. The palace has always been just a front. Even before Victor Reynolds took it from you, why do you think the mob chose this location in the first place? Catherine's eyes widened. Michael, he never knew that his beloved restaurant was built with mob money, that his construction loans came from less than legitimate sources. Oh, he figured it out eventually. That's why Victor had to deal with him. Alexandra's smile turned cruel, just like he dealt with David when he got too curious, and now... But she never finished the sentence. In her focus on the women in front of her, she hadn't noticed Jenny quietly moving along the wall. Now Jenny, swung a heavy copper pot, knocking the gun from Alexandra's hand. The weapon skittered across the floor as chaos erupted. Men came running from the cellar as Detective Harrison's team burst in from multiple entrances. "Police, nobody move!" Gunfire erupted from the cellar. Sarah pulled Cora behind a steel prep table as bullets pinged off kitchen equipment. Catherine and Rebecca took cover behind an industrial refrigerator while Jenny crawled toward the kitchen's emergency exit. Through it all, Alexandra Maxwell slipped away in the confusion. "The evidence," Catherine shouted over the noise. "We need proof of what's in." "Those crates!" Sarah looked around desperately, then spotted a small digital camera on a shelf, probably left by one of the renovation surveyors. She grabbed it and army crawled toward the cellar stairs. "Sarah, no!" Rebecca tried to stop her, but the young waitress was already moving. More police were arriving now, surrounding the building. Through the kitchen windows, they could see emergency lights painting the smoke red and blue. Sarah reached the cellar just as Thomas was trying to close the heavy door. She caught it with her foot and squeezed through, tumbling down the stairs. The cellar was chaos, men trying to move crates while others fired at police coming through the tunnel entrance. Sarah raised the camera and started taking pictures. "Stop her!" Thomas shouted. But before anyone could move, a familiar voice rang out, "Nobody move or the whole place goes up." Alexandra Maxwell stood by the old wine racks, holding what looked like a detonator. At her feet were explosives, enough to bring down the whole building. 30 years of work, she said through gritted teeth. "I won't let it end like this." "It's over, Alexandra." Cora walked slowly down the cellar stairs, her voice steady. "Let it go. Stay back." Alexandra's hand shook on the detonator. "I'll do it. I'll bring it all down." "Like you brought Michael down?" Cora kept walking. "Like Victor brought down David Chen. How many more lives are you willing to destroy?" "You don't understand," Alexandra's voice cracked. "They own me. They've owned me since I was a young lawyer. One mistake, one moment of weakness, and they had me. Everything I did, I had no choice." "There's always a choice," Catherine said, joining Cora. "I chose to run to protect my daughter. Michael chose to stand up to them, even knowing it might cost him everything. What do you choose now?" For a moment, the only sound was water dripping somewhere in the old cellar. Then Alexandra's shoulders slumped. "I'm so tired," she whispered. Detective Harrison himself took the detonator from her unresisting hands, while his team secured the weapons and arrested the remaining criminals. Later, as dawn broke over Boston, they all sat in the restaurant's main dining room. The fire had been contained to the kitchen area, leaving the historic dining room untouched. Emergency crews were clearing out, while crime scene technicians documented everything. "The weapons are just the start," Harrison told them. "Based on what we found in those crates and Alexandra Maxwell's testimony, we can bring down 3 major crime families. Their hold on Boston is finally ending." "And the palace?" Sarah asked quietly. Cora looked around at the place she'd loved so much. The crystal chandeliers, the elegant moldings, the spaces where so many memories had been made. "I think," she said slowly, "it's time for a change." 6 months later, the Golden Palace's grand reopening was the talk of Boston. But it wasn't just the city's elite filling the tables tonight. The newly renovated restaurant now included a community dining room where anyone could enjoy a good meal, regardless of their ability to pay. The foundation had been re-established, dedicated to helping small businesses and families in need. Cora stood in the entrance, greeting guests alongside Rebecca, who now managed the restaurant. Sarah had been promoted to event coordinator, while Jenny ran the community dining program. Catherine had retired but still came by every day to help with the books. Judge Hawkins, fully recovered, raised a glass in a toast. "To Michael and David. Their dream lives on." "And to new beginnings," Cora added, watching a young couple walk in off the street, clearly nervous about entering such an elegant place. Rebecca immediately went to welcome them, just as Michael would have done. Later that night, after the last guest had left, Cora stood in the kitchen, newly rebuilt, but still feeling like home. On the wall hung 2 photographs, Michael Sullivan and David Chen, smiling in their chef's whites. "We did it," she whispered to them. "We made it what it was always meant to be." Sarah found her there, looking at the photos. "You okay, Mrs. Sullivan?" "Just thinking," Cora smiled. Michael always said that a restaurant was like life itself. Messy and complicated, but beautiful if you have the right ingredients. And what are the right ingredients? Love, Cora said simply. Courage, hope, and most importantly, family. Not just the one you're born with, but the one you find along the way. She looked around at this place that had seen so much. Tragedy and triumph, loss and love, endings and beginnings. The Golden Palace wasn't just a restaurant anymore. It was a testament to the power of dreams, the strength of friendship, and the simple truth that it's never too late for justice, for healing, for hope. Outside, Boston's lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere, Michael. Sullivan smiled down on the dream that had finally come true. The end.